Welcome to Mid-Maryland Votes, a place for ideas, not insults, where real conversations still happen. On this episode, we sit down with Nancy Allen, former Frederick County Board of Education member, and Jaime Brennan, current board member, to tackle some of the most controversial issues facing our schools today. From teachers' union influence and identity politics in the classroom, to parental opt-out rights, disputed library content, and the recent interim appointment that has sparked county-wide debate. This is a candid conversation about authority, accountability, and who really shapes public education. Now let's get into it. Welcome to Mid-Maryland Votes. I am your host, Mark Flynn. With me is my co-host,
Ethan Lowen.
And we have two very distinguished guests tonight. Ethan, why don't you introduce our guests?
Two members of the Frederick County Board of Education. One is Nancy Allen, and we have Jaime Brennan, also of the Frederick County Board of Education. If you want to say hello as well.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
And obviously, we love to have members of the boards of education on the podcast because obviously one of the most important functions, if not the most important function of government, is to help provide a nurturing environment for children, and our public schools are one of the primary functions that's done with. So we want to thank you for being here this evening. There are a number of issues, as always, going on with our public schools, particularly in Maryland. There's a battlefield in our public schools of philosophies. But before we get into it, I do want to say, Nancy, you did recently resign.
So we moved to Pennsylvania, and under Maryland law, I no longer can hold my position on the Board of Ed if I am no longer a resident of the county. As of December 1st, our home in Maryland sold. So according to Maryland law, I had to tender my resignation.
And of course, we were actually very sorry to see that you have to go. You have done a phenomenal job during your years on the board. It really is just citizens, average people, much like anyone who is listening right now, who are just stepping up and saying, you know what, I'm going to put in my blood, sweat, and tears, my effort, my energy, my emotions into trying to make our community the best it can be. And life happens. Life happens to local politicians just as it does with everyone else. So we do want to congratulate you on what I'm sure is in many ways a very positive next step for you and your family.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
If you want to explain to us kind of what your experience on the board has been, because you came on a couple years earlier than Jaime did, a different circumstance where it was just you as your particular standards and things that you were cheerleading and wanting to bring to the public schools. If you can just explain to us what your time on the board was like.
There were three other members who were elected, and they were Democrats, and they campaigned on pretty much everything opposite of what I campaigned for. So when I was elected, I was surprised, number one. I was a little dismayed that there were no other conservatives who were elected at the time. I think there were some very close, it could have swayed the other way, but it didn't. I got elected as one of four seats that were open. And I'm going to say that I think their expectations were where I was going to be different than I was. I'm a team player. I mean, in the sense that I'm willing to work with people. I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to try to understand positions. I had probably 2 or 3 months of a lot of anxiety, trying to get on board, trying to develop relationships. There were 3 individuals who are already on the board as I stepped into it. Sue Johnson was very welcoming, and she reached out to me prior to me actually taking the seat to get a feel for who I was and, my views, and I appreciated that. So I told Sue, I said, my job, the way I look at it, my job um, is to work for the people that elected me and to represent them as best as I could. And there were going to be some differences, and we were going to butt heads, and we were going to have difference of opinions. But I feel like Mr. J, Sue Johnson, and David Bass were very respectful of my positions. There was no real animosity that I felt, but I did, the individuals who still sit on the board, Karen, Ray, and Dean, I was in opposition to them almost 100%. I felt that Sue and David and Mr. J were more willing to work with me, at least hear me out. They may not agree with me, but they weren't going to shut me down. And that was the one thing that Sue said to me. She says, you'll always have a voice. I won't shut you out. I won't try to not allow you to be heard. She was true to that. So I have to say that, the first 2 years, it was a struggle. I certainly, I won one battle.
That was a great battle.
What battle was that?
It was the most important battle ever.
Not necessarily, but it was something that it surprised me, I think, as much as it surprised the rest of the board. That the board had, in my opinion, had abdicated their responsibility and turned over to the Family Life Advisory Committee the responsibility of approving curriculum for the classroom. And that really is a job of the board. It's not a job of a board committee. It's a job of the full board. And every member on that board needs to have a say. You have to have three votes to get it on the agenda. So I was able to get board members to agree to that. It came to a vote, and we moved it back to the board. So now the board is approving curriculum. The Family Life Advisory Committee has to move it from the committee to the board for approval. They're no longer, they were, I think it was, might have been 2 years, Jamie, that they had approval to place curriculum in the classroom without board approval.
Access to the curriculum, what curriculum goes into our classes, is a huge responsibility. I am very happy that you won that fight, Nancy, and got that back under the preview of the Board of Education, which is where it belongs.
I say it was a win. I mean, I think that there's still a big battle. The introduction of material that is inappropriate, not only just age inappropriate, but just inappropriate, period, for public school systems. And, the Family Life Advisory Committee, since that ruling, I don't think has presented anything to the board. The last thing I would want to happen is some kind of backdoor process, implemented to avoid board,
Scrutiny.
Board input. Yeah.
And Jamie, when you mentioned that battle was the most important battle that Nancy won on behalf of the community, why do you say that? What was important about it, and what is the larger issue?
Well, I think, at the time, so since then, the Maryland State Department of Education has reworked some of their health curriculum. But at the time, I shouldn't say curriculum, because MSD did not set a specific curriculum, a framework. The framework that MSDE had us teaching gender identity in pre-K and K. And so what had happened was the Frederick County Board of Education had actually adopted that suggested framework, I think in 2019. And the idea was that they would adopt it, and they would through the Family Life Advisory Committee, implement the new standards, implement the curriculum in line with that framework. And so the Family Life Advisory Committee was beginning to get very heated at those committee meetings, because they were showing videos and things from organizations like Advocates for Youth, and Amaze, which is related to Advocates for Youth, and they put out videos. That's where they're. Amaze is like their content producer. They were using a lot of really inappropriate materials in the class. They were presenting those. Now they weren't getting vote, like the committee was in disarray. So to some degree, thankfully, it wasn't moving forward. But because the committee meets during the day, at the time, none of them were videotaped. So you really couldn't get a lot of parental feedback. And so it was such a great win to bring that back to the board, because when that stuff's presented to us, they were supposed to show it and present it at a public meeting. You try to get stuff out there to families and you say, hey, this is the thing they're going to vote on. And you spread it around, you share it with your friends, and they share it, and the next thing you get is like, oh my gosh, they're not actually gonna use that. You know what I mean? And that isn't really gonna be what's there. And so it's hard to break through. But when it's part of the board docs and the official documentation of the Board of Education, and they flash that up on their big screens while we watch it in the boardroom, it's really hard to deny it. And so that's why I said such a huge vote, because it was such a huge win, because she made it where that stuff has got to be front and center in everybody's face.
Yeah, and Jamie made a good point. It becomes part of the record too for the board. So it's not, in board docs, then it is historical then. You know what I'm saying? It never can be removed. And that vote is recorded. The board comments are recorded. Everything is there, whether it's in the meeting minutes or in the video, so you have it. And I do think that that's important, because there's a lot of pushback about what is really going on in the classroom, and until, parents really bring evidence before the board or before staff or before administrators, there's a lot of, smoke and mirrors, oh no, that's not going on. Oh no, that's not happening. We're not seeing that. It's on you to prove that it's actually going on and happening.
That there are things happening in the classroom that parents in general are not aware of. And when parents do become aware of it, that there actually is an effort to suppress that knowledge or that complaint. Is that where you're headed with this?
Absolutely. I think that's true. But there has been evidence presented, and I'm speaking as a past board member. There is evidence that has been presented to us via email by parents and even by staff, some staff. There's deniability about it. They're denying that it's actually taking place, or they're saying it's a one-off, or, oh, that particular teacher, took that upon themselves to do that. When you really feel that, no, that's probably not the case. It probably is actual material that is, more widely used and more widely presented than they wanted you to believe. Parents get discouraged because parents do what parents feel like they need to do. They start at the school level with the teacher. Then they may go to the administrator. Then they'll send it to the board. So might be the last chain of that communication. Many parents will track that and allow us to see, the communication that has happened. As a board, we would go to the central office and Dr. Dyson, the superintendent, and ask her to do, to look into it, to find out. Many times we got responses that I felt were less than satisfactory. Sometimes you have to ask over and over and over again to get where you need to be, to get the information that you feel like you deserve in order to be satisfied and be able to go back to the parent and give them what they need to either feel better about their kid in that classroom, or for them to understand that the situation has been dealt with and that the situation has been addressed.
So Nancy, you and Jamie both indicated that there was certain curriculum that if parents were aware of it, they would probably be horrified that it was being taught in the schools. Is this prevalent throughout the whole Frederick County Public School system, and what can you give us some examples of what that curriculum might be?
Absolutely. A lot of the worst part of it is the family life and human sexuality stuff. Now, I will say that we've had somewhat of a shift in Dr. Dyson's tenure, and specifically after a couple people who had been there previously are no longer with Frederick County Public Schools,
Right.
that were in key positions kind of directing some of this stuff. But if you were familiar with the case, the Mahmoud v. Taylor case that came out of Montgomery County.
Yeah, we did several episodes on that, actually.
Yeah. So what they were obviously doing, for anybody who doesn't know, is that they were basically taking stuff, LGBTQ, gender stuff, and they were shoehorning it into regular subjects, because family life, you can opt out, regular subjects, you're stuck with it. And so they're basically pushing it through everything else. We were on that path. Now, there are certain people who were kind of pushing that who are no longer with the school system. And it seems like that here in Frederick County has really slowed down as far as shoehorning it specifically, and not that there are not teachers doing it, but as a district, the appetite for mixing it in as a point of curriculum, that seems to be waning. And definitely, I think in light of, the decision with Mahmoud, there's certainly not going to be like a formal policy to do that, as was adopted in Montgomery County. So, but I think a lot of it is around the family life. The specific things we're talking about gender identity. Specifically, there are books that were part of kindergarten pre-K reading that would have a character that was, gender questioning, where they would kind of bring up these topics. It was part of videos that they would show as part of family life. So a lot of it was around that. Now, the confusing part about that is grades 4 and up is where we would typically think of as sex ed, right? Like when you say that, that's when we are talking about the human reproduction side, and taught as a specific part of a health curriculum in those grades for a specific duration and time period. And usually there's, they don't give you enough notice, in my opinion, but they send home a note, and they, there is some notice about, hey, we're going to teach it this week and that sort of thing. And you can opt out. Grades K through 3 did not have a specific opt-out process, because it wasn't human reproduction. It was part of family life. Parents were not given notice in the same way they are when they were talking about the human reproduction kind of sex ed kind of stuff. So a lot of that was drifting in, because they would just, randomly have a little lesson on family life on a Tuesday morning. Right. And it could have been anything that they did. They could have read, My Little Puppy, or, and they kind of shoehorned a little lesson in there about family life. And I think that there's a lot of parents too. For instance, I had a parent reach out to me, and her daughter had been given in family life, a little paragraph. It was, a couple paragraph little story prompt. And it was given to 6th graders. Okay. And the characters in the prompt were 8th graders. And it was a boy and a girl. And they were, started out they liked each other, getting to know each other. And then it progressed to part of it discussed, we were touching each other above our clothes. And it points are are we going to do it? 6th graders were given this prompt, right? And at one point, one of the kids was over at the other kid's house. No parents were home, and it was not shown to this mom, who asked to see all the materials they were going to use in the class. It was not given to her, but it was used in the class. And this class was a mixed sex class. So it was boys and girls together discussing this prompt, discussing what should they have done? Was somebody feeling pressured to engage in sex with sixth graders? And I think that if a lot of parents knew that, knew that kind of stuff is getting in there, they'd be really angry. I mean, certainly this mom was very angry. And to Nancy's point previously, the dancing and the gaslighting began because it was a rogue teacher using unapproved materials. You know what I mean? Like, that's the same song and dance you get every time. A rogue teacher using unapproved curriculum, right? Like, but there's no punishment for that. There's no sanctions for that. There's no getting back the innocence for those children, right?
No apology.
No apologies, no formal acknowledgement, just I know they don't ever make the teacher formally or publicly admit that they really did something wrong. You get the glossed over apologies from admin saying that really wasn't supposed to be in there. We'll do better. You know what I mean? That doesn't fix anything. I mean, there is no fixing that. But for those of us who do not raise our children in those situations, you have just introduced something to my sixth grader that they never in a million years were contemplating in their little 6-year-old head, who's still playing make-believe. So my sixth grader had no concept of stuff like that. And I think a lot of other parents, their kids also don't, or they would just be horrified that school was introducing that.
I think one thing that horrifies parents across the board, whether their children are acclimated to some of these R-rated movies or whatever, is the fact that they're being kept in the dark. That is the most heinous part of this curriculum. Much of it is geared towards the ignorance of parents. During COVID, I think a lot of parents came awake. We saw what our kids were being taught. We heard what they were being taught. And we're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. This kid is way too young for this material, So in a sense, COVID exposed a lot of what was being taught in these classrooms in order for us to be able to address it.
But radicalized me because my kids were home. They were middle school and late elementary aged when we were home. And my office sits right across from my dining room table. I have a little office in the front part of my house, and we had the dining room table. And we had the kids at the dining room table, so I could see and watch what they were doing all day. And then I was hearing what was coming out of the speakers on their computer. And I thought, what in the world is going on in these schools? And that's really what got me going, to be honest with you.
The parents that over the last several years have come out in large numbers all around the country, including here in Maryland, and have said that their children are being sexualized. That is indeed occurring. Which is absolutely terrifying. And Nancy, from your perspective, what were your thoughts as you were coming to realize that this is what our public schools have become?
Prior to me becoming a board member, I had submitted, along with Cindy Rose, an appeal to the board to have books removed from the Frederick County Public School libraries. And those books, there were 57 books total, and 58 books total that we had submitted an appeal for. And, we had originally just asked to have them removed. We didn't, we weren't looking to ban books. Everybody kind of got on board and said, you're trying to ban books, shame on you. We lost that appeal. And those books remain within Frederick County Public Schools. And there's probably twice as many books now that are as age inappropriate and inappropriate for Frederick County Public Schools that are in the libraries today. But the other thing that really opened my eyes to what was going on in the classrooms during that process was that we then learned that every teacher has their own library in their classroom. And that is not monitored. that nobody knows unless you're a parent and you physically go in there and you look at what that teacher has in their classroom. There's no accountability for that whatsoever. We had asked in our appeal, as one of the resolutions for the appeal was to have an annual inventory done of classroom libraries. Well, they didn't want anything to do with that. That was like asking for the moon. That was not going to happen. They were very adamant about it. Like that was, they felt like that was stepping on the teacher's right to have their own material, blah, blah, blah. But I sat across from those board members that I was on the board with for 2 years. And we physically read quite a few, and we had included that in our appeal, the language and the content of those books, and not a flinch. I mean, literally not a flinch. They were stone-faced, looked at us, listened to us, and voted down on the appeal. They're the ones, and I'm going to say, along with Dr. Dyson, allow those books to be on the library shelves today.
And these books that you're referring to, these are the ones that have been in the news around the country.
Yeah.
Where the accusation is that they are actually pornographic.
It's straight out like graphic.
Very graphic.
Photographic and graphic in description, and they're how-to books. I mean, many of them are, and many of them are, we got a lot of pushback because many of those books were books that had content in them about gay relationships. There were many of them that were so age inappropriate. It really was quite an eye-opener. And at that point, I have to say, I was really disappointed, and I was somewhat discouraged about my ability to do anything really proactive on the board after that. I mean, I still continued to fight. I still, felt like I needed to represent those who voted for me and placed me in that position. But it was a real eye-opener to understand that there really are the adults in the room who turn away and just say, it's not my problem.
There's a contingent that believes that it is good and right to introduce this stuff to children. They think they are doing the right thing by introducing this content to children. They think that denying this content is you are harming children for not doing it. And I said something about protecting innocence. The innocence of these children. Not every child knows about these things or has heard about these things or even contemplated these things, and you're stealing some innocence from them when they're confronted with it. And they're like, innocence is an aspect of privilege. It's not an admirable thing to have children have this kind of innocence. And I was really shocked by that attitude, but it's pervasive. It's pervasive in the public, and it's pervasive in the classroom.
I think it's also pervasive in those parents who have abdicated their responsibilities to parent their own children. These are the same parents who let their kids curse. They let them smoke and vape. They let them drink. They're like, well, it's inevitable anyway. And, they let them do these dangerous lifestyle choices in a complete abdication of their own parenthood. And they expect that the school board and the teachers to do most of the heavy lifting for them.
Yeah. So, hey, I do want to add one more point about the books, and because they are what they term graphic novels, they slide under that radar of being pornographic material. So
when you say graphic novel, people should think comic books, right?
Correct. Exactly. And that's how they're structured.
When you say graphic novel, I was shown one of these from one of the books that I'm sure you're referring to. The graphic, it literally a drawing of it couldn't be more explicit, the most explicit sexual act. actual drawings right there in children's public school books. And Jamie, I was shocked when you said the response that you got from some leaders in our public school system was that it is actually a sign of privilege to not have been sexualized as a child. To me, that is terrifying that we have a group of people who believe that protecting children throughout their childhood is a negative thing. In one of the high schools, there was a sexual assault involving a sexual toy from students against other students. And the sexual toy had been literally paraded around by this child for a long time before the sexual assaults occurred. What would you say to something like that?
So I'm limited on talking about that particular topic because obviously we are in the midst of several legal aspects of that whole scenario. But in general, my personal opinion is that it does come from the same place. It comes from the same place of we are not going to put boundaries or rules on student behavior. And that starts with, like what Mark was saying, as far as, parents not parenting. I tell people all the time, like, parent is a verb. It means it's an action word. It is not just something you sit back and do. And the same thing applies in our education system. We let a lot of really terrible behavior slide, and we do not adequately punish it. And this is an example of, people in that school thought it was funny that a student was carrying around a sex toy on the regular. And there are people who it happened so much that nobody stopped it. I mean, it was there. Some of those kids in our high schools are 14 years old. And I think that that's all part of it. We have no decent boundaries anymore.
To your point, Jamie, when you're talking about permissive parenting and a lack of boundaries, many people bring up the teachers' unions and their ability to screen for teachers and to allow this permissive behavior into our schools. What's your feelings towards the teachers union and their role?
I believe they play a big role in the climate of the schools. I think that there are a lot of the agenda that the NAA and even the local union feel is appropriate for the classroom. The majority of parents don't. But they have power, and they have an ability to push their agenda without any pushback from the administrators. I don't want to use the word intimidation. I don't know if that's what they do, but it seems to me that the central office staff have abdicated their responsibility of upholding a lot of the standards and a lot of the rules and the policies and the will of the community as it's expressed in public comment by parents, to really allow the union to do what they want to do. The power that's behind the national union is so big that it really, Moms for Liberty is probably the only organization that I've seen that's been able to really expose and push back against a lot of the agenda items that these unions have put into the public school system.
Jamie, how about you? What's your feelings towards the unions?
Oh, I share a lot of Nancy's opinions. And, the reality is, the unionization of the education system going back 100 years when they, started the first union in New York has always been about introducing progressivism and collectivism into the classroom. So that was their goal all the way back in the 20s when they were starting teachers unions in New York City. And it's just progressed. And when you listen to when you look at what their national meetings, the topics on those meetings are, even just, our local, when they have their big meeting in October every year down in Ocean City, it's never improving student performance. It's all left-wing causes. And I think just like every other organization, the people who choose to get into leadership are usually the mouthiest, most obnoxious ones. And so they're coming at it from advocates themselves, and everybody else doesn't have time. They got kids. No, they don't want to go be the president of this thing. They got a couple kids or coaching or whatever. They don't got time for this nonsense. And so who does get into those positions? The people passionate about using that role for something other than improving, education. And I think too, what we're seeing a little bit though, is all of this stuff, all the things that are bad that are happening in our schools, in addition to the sexual stuff that we're talking about. But I mean, just like regular discipline, can't get rid of all we hear now all the time from teachers, complaining wise, is about, classroom management issues, interruptions in the class, kids get taken out of class and they get a snack and a cookie and they get brought right back in, whatever. Okay. Like all these things that make managing a classroom hard, make teaching hard, the behavior, the mouthiness, the physical assaults. That's the direct outcome of policies they have pushed for 50 years in our system. We can't suspend bad students. I didn't push that as a parent. Nancy didn't push that as a parent or a board member. You guys probably wouldn't have pushed something like that, but the union did. Okay. So the union has pushed the policies that are now in our classrooms and causing havoc and stress for the teachers. And they say, oh, well, we can't keep teachers. Teachers burn out. Well, because they're dealing with kids that are behavioral monsters and they can't do anything about it. There's no discipline. There's no suspending. There's no expelling. Those aren't policies that the four of us voted for. Right. They're policies they voted for. They're policies that the people that they buy in Annapolis vote for and put into state law. So all of the bad things are things that came from the union in some way, shape, or form. And look, I mean, when I ran last year, the union spent over $50,000 to defeat me in little old Frederick County.
Yeah.
They when their statewide union had stopped these terrible extremists, and I was on their flyer.
In the entire state, you actually were number one. You, like you said, you literally were the poster child for who they opposed.
And I started the Frederick County Moms for Liberty. And so, I mean, that was like anything they could do to keep me off of there, was what they were going to do. So.
And what you bring up is fascinating because it relates to a previous episode we did with a individual named Dustin Bain, where he was discussing an issue that he was trying to work on with getting cameras in the classrooms of nonverbal autistic children for their safety. And what he described is that the teacher union went to negotiations with staff about the initial issue of cameras. So it wasn't input from parents. It wasn't input even from teachers per se. It was the officers of the teachers union sitting down with staff, talking to them.
They weren't in that meeting, accepting input. They were dictating at that meeting.
Yes.
The unions were dictating what they would accept and what they wouldn't.
But my understanding is that part of the problem is that the teachers union has an arm that also happens to be the union for public school staff.
So there's 3 bargaining units that we work with, and that all have their own representation. So the support staff, the bus drivers, our lunch ladies, our IAs, that's one union. The actual teachers themselves is another union, and the administrators, not the high cabinet level people, not the people in director positions,
Right.
but the administrators, school administrators, they also have their own union.
So what you're describing is that the staff of public schools, from both the teacher level all the way up to administration, is we're dealing with individuals who have spent most, if not all, of their careers in the union, going through the union, let's call it culturalization. And so in that environment, you have essentially the teachers union dictating the terms. Then what he described is that their recommendations go before the board. There are these other school board members who are essentially in agreement with the union, and endorsed by the unions. And so what ends up happening is then the teachers' recommendations in those staff meetings then go before a primarily teacher union endorsed board to then essentially be rubber stamped.
I'm going to have to let Nancy answer this because we are currently in a pilot, and for 4 cameras in our classroom, and commenting on the pilot could be taken as not negotiating in good faith, since we're also in negotiations. But Nancy knows all the deets, so I'll let her weigh in.
It should be stated, though, to our audience that the reason that the pilot happened, and it was denied at first for Dustin, was because his child was proven to be assaulted by a teacher, various schools, and was not acted on. And that's why the pilot program came into existence, is from what I understand.
Yes, and I'll just give you my understanding. Dustin is correct in what he explained to you in the process that he tried to go through to help those children who are the most vulnerable population that we serve in the public schools. And it is just heartbreaking and tragic. It is hard for me to even fathom a parent, being brought this news to them, about their child, about anything, as adverse and ugly as this was. And the fact that the school system allowed an individual who there were suspicions of his behavior to continue to work with children, and in the classroom, and not be supervised in the way that he should have been supervised, or he should have just been removed from the classroom, period. And that he was moved around. So, and that's one of the things that I think was most difficult, was to understand that a lot of these individuals who are who are employed by Frederick County Public Schools, and I'm not going to say they're all teachers or all of them, but any individual who's employed, and it speaks to disciplinary actions across the board, not just with students, but with staff, that the unions play a role in preventing the real consequences that should take place with bad behavior. I can tell you that the pilot program was put in place because I think staff recognized at that point, we have to do something. We can't just sit back on our hands. They were going to be crucified. Let me tell you, it didn't matter what side of the aisle you sat on. This was tragic. This was horrible. It was like, this was one thing that probably brought both sides together. This has to be fixed. We cannot continue to bring this tragedy into our classrooms. We just can't. There has to be a way to solve it. The problem could have been solved years ago to prevent these actions, as you stated, Ethan. Their union prevented it from happening. I mean, that's my opinion, but I'm going to tell you that I think that if all came before the court, that's exactly how it would play out, that the union prevented this from
Well,
happening.
on the show, Dustin stated emphatically that he had one over the council, he had one over the BOE, the Board of Education, that it was pretty much a done deal until the union started negotiating with administrative staff, and then it went right off the table. He was shocked at how fast, basically got overturned. And as a
Yes.
result, those cameras were not put in the classroom.
Right.
Children were abused. They've been proven to be abused. There was a person charged with those crimes and is
Right.
now pending trial. But all of that could have been prevented if the union had supported this maneuver instead of fighting it.
I don't know. I felt like, the perception of what the union is supposed to do, the union is there for the teachers. The union's not there for the students. And I think a lot of parents don't understand that the union isn't there for your student, isn't there for your child. They're there to protect the teachers and the administrators. They don't care about the children. They
No.
really don't. There's
No.
nothing that they've done. There's no agenda that they've put out in the past 100 years that says, I support the student in the classroom. Teachers may feel that way that are part of the union, but the union is not there for the student. So
They're not there for the parents either.
they're
No.
not. You're right.
They're on
absolutely
record
right.
as saying that parental rights don't exist in the school system. I mean, many
Yes.
unions have that position. It's crazy.
Really good point, Mark. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true.
And here's the
Yeah.
other thing. We both, all of us have teachers that we love, right? There's teachers in the Frederick County Public School system that are amazing. I have several of them. I live in Myersville. We have a dozen teachers here that I love. They're great. I trust them with my children, but they
Right.
are not the union. People need to separate in their minds what the teacher union is. Nancy, your replacement on the board was appointed by Jessica Fitzwater, who is a liberal member of the Frederick County Council. Obviously, the people who elected you were mostly conservative in nature, expected perhaps a conservative candidate. However, the candidate is far from conservative and, as a matter of fact, is a member of several unions.
Actually, I think he's the secretary for the state union, isn't he?
I think so.
Yeah.
Jamie, I don't know if you can speak to this matter right now, but I thought Nancy would have a great opportunity.
Well, I'll just say that I was disappointed in the pick. I don't know Chad at all. I do know of him. I know about him. I have not ever engaged with him in a conversation or had any debate. So I personally don't know him. I know his positions. I know what he stands for. And, that's pretty much contrary to everything that, put me on the board, the people who elected me. I understand that people are upset. I know that people are upset. I don't like the process. I would change that process. I would advocate to the state to change that process, because I think that if anything, we probably could have had just a special election for that. But you could leave the seat empty. Until the next election, if it's within that election year, which it was. So it's like, you could have left the seat empty for that period of time.
And the most troubling part of it is that he is a declared candidate for that position. So he's getting basically a free tryout and an opportunity to establish roots in a position that should be a fair election.
He's getting an unfair advantage, actually. That's the way I see it. It can work for him and it can work against him, because depending on how he votes and what comes before him and where his positions, it could work against him. But more than likely, he's got lots of friends on the board. So,
well, in his press release, he mentioned several times the fact that the conservative agenda is not part of his life, and if you support that, then you are basically at war with his children, which is a pretty radical thing to say when you're about to assume duties as a Board of Education member.
I think that's one of the disadvantages of this nonpartisan position, on the board.
Absolutely, without question. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the first thing that any informed voter does is when they go to the school board is try to figure out who's a Republican, who's a Democrat.
Yeah, yeah. And that's
Very
what I
first thing
said.
you do.
I know campaign material should have there. We're Republicans. We're conservative. It's like you should not try to like play it like you're middle of the road. So.
Well, we got a big election coming up. There's no doubt about that. We have an election coming up and an opportunity to flip the Frederick County Board of Education like they did similarly in Washington County. And I know Ethan was a big part of that too. Ethan, right?
I did my best.
All right, you did very well. He's an expert campaigner. Ladies, I just want to thank you so much for being on our show tonight. There's a lot of things we wanted to talk about. Ethan was over here biting at the bit with all the things he wanted to talk about. This is a passion for him, and I'm glad that you guys were able to come on and talk to us about these really important topics about our children.
Thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate the opportunity. And, I think that Jamie and Colt do a fantastic job to represent, those who sat them on the board. And Jamie is a powerhouse, I'm telling you. And when she was elected to the board, I think I did the happy dance for 3 days. I mean, literally, I was over the moon. I thought, oh my gosh, and I was like, God answers prayers.
I appreciate that very much. Jamie, you definitely were an answer to a lot of our prayers, but I don't even think it's a Democrat and Republican issue. It's a common sense parent issue.
It is. That is it. Thank you, Nancy. That was very kind of you. But yeah, I mean, that's what it is. It shouldn't be, it should not be partisan, but it is, because honestly, that informs our decision making. I mean, I call myself a Republican. I mean, I'm registered as a Republican because I agree with those ideas that the Republican Party broadly supports. So, of course, if I agree with those things, that's going to inform how I vote. And a huge parental rights advocate. And I don't think that, our schools respect parental rights. Our school system has lived off of the goodwill that we all have from the idea of our teachers. I remember this teacher who I loved and was so influential, and we have these warm feelings about this, and the union has taken advantage of our kind of warm feelings in general about teaching. And I mean, it is a thankless profession for the people who do it. I mean, do not get paid enough. They, all of the things they work, the ones who really love it are passionate about it, and just, that nobody works harder, and it's a hard job, and we all know that. So we want to have goodwill about it, and they've taken that and they've used it against us.
So we appreciate you being on Mid-Maryland Votes, because that's exactly what we do. We create ideas and thought processes, and hopefully people do their due diligence and their research and figure out who to vote for in this upcoming election, which is a very, very important election for Frederick County Board of Education.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Well, ladies, thank you so much for being with us. My name is Mark Flynn. I'm here with Mid-Maryland Votes. With me, as always, is my co-host,
Ethan Lowen.
I want to thank our very special guests from the Board of Education here in Frederick County tonight. If you liked what you saw, share it on both Facebook and YouTube, and we will see you next time on Mid-Maryland Votes. That wraps up our conversation with Nancy Allen, former Board of Education member, and Jaime Brennan, current Frederick County Board member. From union influence and classroom boundaries to parental rights and controversial appointments, these issues are shaping the direction of Frederick County Public Schools right now. Some parents may feel the deck is stacked, but ultimately, voters decide the direction of our schools. The upcoming elections matter. Do your research, know your candidates, make sure they align with your values. If you believe real conversations matter, hit like, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. If you loved it, share it with a friend. If you hated it, share it with an enemy. We're equal opportunity entertainment.